What is the #1 single trick that's going to make the biggest difference in taking a beginner animation to the next level? That's what I was asking Satomi, one of our most skilled animators. A lot of people send her their animations, some wanting to join our show, others looking for advice on how to improve. She saw a pattern in those animations that kept coming up with each one she saw. The answer she gave me is what I'm making this first chapter all about. My name is Michael Huang, and thank you for joining me in this graphy. The animation you just saw uses the techniques you're about to learn, and they're what this first chapter is all about. This graphy is made with the assumption that you can use Adobe Animate at a basic level. You know the layout of the program, you can create symbols, and you know what tweens do, just things you can learn from the manual. But if not, that's still okay because it should still be possible to follow along. Let's go. Now, the way this chapter is going to go is that instead of me giving you a million rules to remember from the start, we're going to sketch out a not so perfect animation, and then I'll give you a set of tips to take it to a much more impressive animation. First, you're going to make sure you have the standard BFDI assets file by going to bfdi.tv/assets, which has all of the original BFDI character art and a lot of outdated art from episode 1. It's basically unchanged since we uploaded it in 2012. Now, if we go over to the library, we're going to see 4 folders, and the one we care about is body parts. And that's what has all of the character bodies, the arms, the legs, the eyes, and the mouths. Now, everything we're about to do, you can definitely do with, for example, blocky body. You can totally use these assets here, but for just this graphy, I've made a grandfather clock asset, which you can also download from the same webpage, but you really don't need it to follow along, it's just here to look cool. Now, we're going to start by making a layer for each of the body parts that we're putting on the stage, so that each symbol has its own layer. And that's because if you're using tweens, which we definitely are, you're going to want each layer to have one symbol. Or Animate's going to give you this, or it'll put a tween 1 in your library and generally not do what you want, so 1 layer per symbol. Now, usually my way of ordering the layers is to put the face, which is the eyes and the mouth, on layers which are right above the body, and the legs go underneath. Then the arm that's closer to the camera goes at the very top, so it's in front of the body, and then the arm that's behind goes in the back. And that's just the way that I usually set it up. Now, each symbol that's on the stage has its own transformation point, and you can drag that point to anywhere that's on or off of the symbol. That's the location that the symbol rotates around when you're tweening it, which makes a pretty big difference in the motion that it makes. So when you're placing the arms and the legs, drag the transformation point to the base of the limb. Or, pro tip, you can double click it to reset it to the registration point, which is the plus-shaped location that it gave the symbol when it first created it. So the same with the legs, double click and double click. Now we can actually play with these as if they're real limbs and like this is a real shoulder that's attached to my body. Similarly, these here are real limbs. And we could drag the bottom edge of this to skew it, like that. Similarly with this. We have now set up our character. Now to make this guy move. Before we do anything, let's put this body symbol inside another symbol. And we're going to do that by using modify convert to symbol. Though personally, I think you should use the keyboard shortcut F8. Like, I truly believe this, enough that I built this custom keyboard just so I could always have access to press F8, instead of having to go to modify convert symbol each time. The keyboard didn't turn out so well. I wish it did. Anyway, let's name this symbol body container and make sure that type is set to graphic. Okay, now in our library, we'll see that body container exists. Now we're going to add motion by adding a keyframe. So for all of these layers have just one keyframe at frame 1, and all of the normal boring frames after it are sort of inheriting whatever the first keyframe was containing. But you'll see that if we select a single frame across all of the layers in our character, right-click, and go to Convert to Keyframes, then each layer now has a keyframe that can store something new. Now we could make whatever changes we want to, and the first keyframe is still holding whatever it used to. And all the normal frames after the new keyframe are inheriting from it. Okay, let's just undo that. So we're going to rotate the arms to give them a new pose, but this guy's arms are already raised. So we're gonna go to the first keyframe and just bring them down. So even though our playhead is not on the keyframe, since it's modifying one of the boring frames, we're just editing that first keyframe. So now we have one keyframe where the arms are low and one where they're high. But we're going to add a third keyframe somewhere in between that marks the start of our motion. And what I did just there was use F6, which is the way that cool people do it, just like that cool keyboard. Anyway, in case we don't have everything selected, we're gonna press Command A or Control A to select everything. Then we'll right click one of these selected frames and hit Create Classic Tween. There we have it, our first object animation. Now those are two arms that are rising over time. Now this guy looks pretty dead. Dead in the body, dead in the eyes. So there's more we can do. If we switch to the transform tool and rotate the body a bit, we can give him some more motion and just to make him look more alive. But now the legs need to stay attached to the body. So we're gonna select them by drawing a rectangle and dragging the top edge of this. But since the feet are sliding like this, we're gonna hold Alt so that the opposite side stays in place. Now this guy is really moving. You know he means it, but his face is still dead. Let's make the eyes change over time. Making sure that the playhead is somewhere after the last keyframe, we'll select one of the eyes. Go to the Properties panel and find the button Swap Symbol. Now we've got a whole bunch of eyes to choose from, and we're gonna choose one of the surprised eyes. And do the same thing with the other eye. Lastly, we're gonna move the playhead to the start of the tween, so to this keyframe. And similarly, use Swap Symbol to change these eyes to eye closed 2. Now look at this. Congratulations, you've made your first object show animation, or your second, or your third, or fourth. Now what we're gonna do is make this guy's movements look so much cooler. We have a basic animation, but what is it that's so unnatural about it? Let's go back to our story about Satomi, our lead animator. What pattern did she see in those beginner animations that fans sent in? The single thing that they could benefit from is easing. Easing is an essential tool that's useful for two reasons. It matches the real-life physics, and it makes it possible to use a certain trick we'll learn about later in this chapter. But about the physics. Think of a car's speedometer. As a car goes from stationary to 60 miles per hour, its speed gradually changes. That is to say, before a stationary object can be fast, it has to start slow and get there over time. If this speedometer were to suddenly snap to 0, something's gone very wrong, and you should probably call an ambulance and maybe a few other organizations. In other words, with animation, you probably already know that you need to continuously move something a little bit each frame from point A to point B. But if you want it to actually look smooth, the speed that it moves also has to be continuous. So if you want something to move smoothly, it can't just switch from stationary to moving. And if it's slow, it can't instantly move fast. And if it's moving in one direction, it can't instantly change directions. So smoothness requires speed to change gradually over time. But smooth is only one of the ways motion can be. If everything is smooth, that's not realistic either. Back to our car example. We know that the car starts stationary and then over time uses its wheels to push against the ground and give it more speed. Then the tree takes it away in a split second. All the way up until the moment it makes contact with the tree, the car's speed is increasing over time. We can even see that the way the speed changes over time says a lot about its physical properties. You'll find that almost every natural motion changes in speed over time based on the forces that caused it. The more hints you can give the viewer about the weight, the shape, the softness, or whatever, the more real you can make an animation feel. And in an artistic way, varying up slow and fast movements just makes things look more interesting. Back into the animation world again. In traditional animation, a motion that starts slow and ends fast is called a slow in. And in the digital age, ease in. And the other way around too. So fast to slow is called a slow out or ease out. Now, this is in no way a rule, but almost every natural motion that doesn't get interrupted by a collision is going to ease in and then ease out in some way or another. I guess it's just natural. All forces come to an end eventually. Now that we know what easing is, back to our animation. First, let's go to the frame where our tween starts, select all, and then switch the Properties panel to Frame. Now, this is the tweening panel, and this is the section that we care about. Right now it says Classic Ease 0, which means constant speed all the way through. What we want is for our character to start slow and end slow, which means we want an ease in-out. Animate gives us a whole collection of ease in-outs to choose from, but we're gonna go with cubic, which is a good middle ground between smooth and snappy. We'll just double click this and already it looks so much better. We can even select these frames and just drag them a bit to extend it. And now we can really observe how much more lifelike it is. But there's more we can do. Let's say this guy is throwing his arms out with such zest and enthusiasm for life that he can't control himself and he throws them too far before pulling them back. Let's do that. We'll just select another frame across all of our character's layers and convert to keyframes. Now we're going to go back and make this original movement even more extreme. So he's raising his arms higher, and he's leaning back further. We might even move him up. And now you can see the legs are not attached anymore. So while holding Alt, the legs should be stretched and skewed to match. Now we'll select all, create classic tween, and then change this to a cubic ease in out as well. Boom, now it looks more natural. And the best part about tweens is that you can change the positions of the endpoints, you can change the timing, and they'll recalculate so that they're always smooth. And to finish it off, we can use the same technique to add a lead-in motion, just to give the viewer some extra time to perceive what's about to happen. Let's just select these frames and move them over a little bit to make room for a new keyframe. So this new keyframe is our new starting point to our motion, and the second keyframe we're going to make a little bit in the opposite direction, so leaning forward a bit and with the arms lowered. We're going to do the same thing to add a classic tween that has the cubic ease in out. And there we have it. And that is a reliable template for making a motion look a little more dressed up. Now that looks more natural, but I'm noticing the feet are actually shifting around a bit. And that's once again because of this thing. So I'm going to move this down to the bottom corner. And that is a pretty reliable technique for making a motion look a little bit more dressed up. It looks both more smooth and more natural than before, but there's still one problem. The eyes are jumping around. Where this problem lies is that making a tween end with a different symbol than it started with causes all the normal frames in between to just inherit the first one, even when it's moving slow at the end. So these eyes are suddenly changing or popping at the point in time where they're moving the slowest, or it's the most noticeable. What we want to do is hide this change when it's moving the fastest, and this is a technique that people who use Adobe Animate or Flash have been doing for years, and this is the secret trick that I mentioned earlier. So we're going to find the part of this tween where it moves the fastest, and what we could tell from the tweening graph is that the exact middle point is the part where the derivative is the highest, to use a word from calculus. That's why we'll find the middle point and make a keyframe that's one frame after. So if this is the middle, we're going to put a keyframe here. Making sure the properties panel is switched to object, we'll use swap symbol and change this eye to what it's supposed to be at the end, which is the surprised eye. We'll do the same thing with the other eye, so create keyframe and swap with a surprised eye. Now as we scrub through the timeline, we can see that this moment of maximum speed has one type of eye before it and one after it. So that's why we swap the eyes one frame after. The movement that's leading in has the same issue where it's popping from open to closed. We're going to do the exact same thing here. So we'll make a keyframe one frame after the middle point, or wherever your eye judges it's the fastest, and swap those open eyes to closed. Now look at that. That is clean. It's great that the popping is gone, but the problem now is that we've chopped up the tweens. So if we try to adjust one of these tweens later on, well then the tween is not going to save us now. It's not going to recalculate because we've baked this keyframe in here. These in-between keyframes are now extra details that we have to update manually, so let's fix that. Right now the blinking and the moving are kind of baked together, but what we want to do is separate them so we don't have to worry about messing up one while we're changing the other. We're going to select the symbols that make up the face, copy, and then delete those layers. Then we're going to double click to go inside the body container that we've previously set up. We're going to make a new layer and paste. Let's just put this in the place where it should be. And just for good measure, we're going to make 2 new layers, one for each of these symbols. Now if we double click to exit the body container, we can see that our face is automatically just part of the body. Because we've put them inside body container, everything that's inside the symbol moves together as one drawing. But we want this drawing to change over time. So let's double click back into our body container. Select, let's say, frame 50 across all of these layers, right click, and insert frame. Or, if you're cool, F5. Let's exit back to the main timeline and find the parts where the eyes should change. So frame 9 is where they should close, and then they'll open on frame 19. Alright, going back into our body container, let's make them close on frame 9, we're going to add a keyframe for each of these eyes, and then do the same thing on frame 19. And if your animation has different timing, those numbers are going to be different. So we'll move the playhead to somewhere after this keyframe, and we'll change the eyes by using a swap symbol. And then the same thing to make these eyes the surprised eyes. So, according to this timeline, the frames are going to close on frame 9 and then open on frame 19. So let's exit back out and watch our animation. That is not correct. Let's fix that. Now, the reason this is happening is because when we were originally animating our body container graphic, it was just 1 frame long. So every time we hit a keyframe, it's resetting to frame 1. We want our body container to advance through time in sync with the main timeline. And the simplest way to do that is to go through every keyframe and make sure that the graphic's starting frame is the same as the frame that that keyframe is at. So since this keyframe is at frame 5, the graphic is going to play its own frame 5. And the same thing here. So this keyframe is on frame 12. So we want our body container's start frame to also be frame 12. There we go, we fixed it. But it was only easy because there weren't really that many keyframes. If there's a lot of keyframes and you don't want to do that with every single one of them, or if your graphic isn't starting at frame 1, and so now your graphics into your frame is 1 while the main timeline is at frame 10. Pro tip, if you don't want to do the math to figure out what frame the graphic should be playing based on where it is in the main timeline, you can add a tween to every single keyframe, even the ones that don't need it, and then hit sync symbols. And then you can remove the tweens afterward. What this is going to do is if a tween has a tween before it, it's going to make the graphic inside of it continue where the graphic of the previous tween left off. And that is a useful feature of tweens that you might not know. So now we have an animated graphic inside our main animation, and that's playing as it should throughout our whole timeline. And if we want, we can make this guy nod up and down, all without messing up our arm raising motion. Beautiful. Like you. There's one more thing that's a little off about this animation. I mean, I'd say it looks pretty good, but one weird thing about it is how all of the body parts slow down and speed up at exactly the same time. You can see there's some frames where the whole body is motionless. I mean, it works, but it's a little dry. The next trick you can add to your tool belt is staggering. When you have an object or a character that's moving, you can have parts of it move a little before or a little after the rest of it, as a way of telling the audience this is attached, but kind of flopping around. Once again, the more hints you can give the audience about the construction of an object, the closer to realism you can get. Let's apply that to the arms here. As a rule of thumb for now, things that are attached to something are going to move a little bit later than the thing they're attached to. So let's select this whole span of frames and drag that selection to the right by 2 frames. And already you can see how it's a little bit more alive, with the motion of the arms sort of filling in the part where the rest of the body is stationary. The problem is now they're sliding around on the body, sort of breaking the illusion that this is a real shoulder. So let's do the same thing we did with the face. We're going to go to the start, select the 2 arms, copy, and delete these layers. Then we're going to double click down into our body container, make a new layer, and paste. We're going to drag these guys into place and then deselect them. Then we'll select the right arm, use Command X or Control X to cut, make a new layer to go in the back, and then use Command Shift V or Control Shift V to paste it in the same place behind everything. Now that we have our arms in place on each layer, we're going to replicate the timing of our outside motion by double-clicking back out onto our main timeline, moving our playhead to each frame, then going back inside, and then making keyframes at those same frames. So here we are at a keyframe on frame 12. We'll make a keyframe at the same point in time. So all we've done is recreate the keyframes from the main timeline just now inside our body container. Now to recreate the same arm motions from earlier. This first keyframe is the beginning of our motion, so it stays the same. And then there's our lead in. And then our big motion upward, and then the recoil. And then we just add the same tweens as before. So we'll select just the span of keyframes, hit Create Classic Tween, and then choose the same ease in out cubic as before. Boom! Now it looks exactly the same as before. But now, if we go inside, select these frames, and then delay them by a couple frames, we now have the same delayed motion. Now the arms both stay connected and are staggered from the main body. And if we really want to go wild, we could extend these last tweens and change up the ease. We can manipulate them however we want. And then we can use the easing editor to change up the ease. And that's an example of staggering. Seriously, congratulations on making this first object animation. Though, I will say the combination of motions we just made goes a little overboard. It's not always going to be appropriate to add an anticipation and an overshoot. In fact, if you start doing this for every motion a character makes, it's going to get repetitive. In fact, my brother Carrie realized this, and he came to a different conclusion. If this recoiling motion is so repetitive, well, repeating is exactly what computers are good at. So he wrote a plugin for Adobe Animate called recoil.jsfl, which lets us use the power of computers to compute how to recoil. And this extension has been so useful that so many years later, compared to all the other plugins both of us have written over the years, recoil is still a tool we consider useful. So if the art of moving from one pose to another is so automatable, why don't we do it like that all the time? That would save so much time and energy, and why are we giving this plugin out for free? Oh yeah, you can download it from the same page that the assets are at. The answer is how something moves is important. If you're animating a character who's saying something, it's more important that the way you animate it conveys the mood and the tone that the scene requires. And a lot of the time, movements that are flashy or overly smooth can take away from your scene just by being distracting, not add to it. So, if you've got a story you want to tell, choose carefully. Maybe that flashy motion is what you need, and if the rest of the scene is low-key in comparison, then once it does come, well, it'll be more impressive and emphasize that moment in the scene. And with that, I want to say thank you for completing this first chapter. Once you're ready to move on to our next subject, which is making mouths move while avoiding common mistakes, I'll see you in Chapter 2.